The Wyoming Territory stretched endless that autumn afternoon, a canvas of ochre grasslands and broken buttes under a sky so wide it seemed to lean against the earth. The stagecoach groaned across the desolate trail near Bitter Creek, wheels biting into ruts carved by wagons before it, the dust trailing like a wounded banner behind. Inside, Clara Hensley shifted her shawl over the heads of her infant twins, their tiny bodies swaddled in pale cloth. Her husband, Thomas, sat across from her, rifle laid across his knees, though the weariness in his eyes revealed how little faith he placed in such frail protection against the frontier's dangers. The coachman cracked his whip, urging the team faster. The air was brittle, the silence heavy with the kind of waiting that belongs to wolves before the leap. Then a sound cut it, sharp, thunderous, a rifle shot splitting the stillness. The lead horse screamed, stumbled. Before Thomas could rise, shadows poured from the rocks above. 3 men, faces hidden beneath kerchiefs, rifles already shouldered. Bullets ripped canvas and wood. The coach swayed, shuddered, and toppled into the ditch. Clara clutched the twins, her shawl a fragile shield against splinters and fire. Thomas sprang, rifle half raised, only to crumple against the floorboards as a shot punched his chest. Clara's cry tore through the chaos, a sound raw enough to halt the wind itself. Another ball found her ribs, driving the breath from her lungs. She pressed her hand against the wound, felt the warmth spreading through cotton blooming dark across her dress. Still, she shielded the children, curling her body like a wall of flesh around them. The bandits swarmed the wreck. Rough hands tore open the strongbox, stripped Thomas's body of coin, ignored Clara as one might ignore a fallen doe. When their greed was satisfied, they vanished back into stone and sage, leaving only wreckage in their wake. The horses broken, the coach ruined, silence swallowing the screams. Clara lay amid splinters and dust, pain racking her body with every shallow breath. The twins whimpered faintly, pressed against her blood-soaked dress. She dragged herself from the coach with one arm, inch by inch, leaving a dark trail in the dust. The sky above had turned crimson with the sinking sun, and Bitter Creek glimmered like steel in the distance. Her prayers came in broken whispers, half to God, half to the babies themselves. Stay with me. Just a little longer. Her vision blurred, the horizon trembling. It was then that Ezekiel Boone appeared. A trail rider, gray-bearded, shoulders bowed by years of dust and war. He had been riding west when the gunfire carried across the prairie. He reined his horse hard at the sight, a wrecked coach, corpses strewn, and amidst them, one woman still clinging to life, twins pressed against her chest. Ezekiel dismounted slowly, boots crunching against the brittle earth. His eyes, lined and shadowed, took in the scene with the weary recognition of a man who had seen too much. Yet something in Clara's gaze, desperate and unbroken, rooted him to the spot. She reached for him with blood-slicked fingers, gripping his wrist with the strength of her final will. Her lips moved, voice rasping like wind through dry grass. "Save my twins." The plea pierced deeper than any bullet ever could. Her hand fell limp, though her chest still stirred faintly with ragged breath. The twins lay silent, faces smeared with her blood, eyes shut as if the world beyond her shawl did not yet exist. Ezekiel stood in the fading light, torn between his nature and the weight suddenly laid upon him. He was a man who had buried too many, a wanderer with no ties but the scars of memory. Yet here, on the edge of Bitter Creek, fate pressed fragile life into his calloused hands. Behind him stretched a trail of death, before him 2 souls demanding a future. The sky burned red with evening. The dust lay heavy with blood, and Ezekiel Boone, once a rider without cause, now stood bound by a dying mother's plea. Ezekiel rode through the gathering dark with the dying woman and her children bundled against his chest. The horse labored beneath the weight, hooves striking frozen ground as wind swept across the hills. He had tied Clara's husband in the back of the coachyard ruins, marking the grave with stones, but he could not leave her, not with her breath still clinging like smoke from an ember. The twins stirred weakly within the folds of the shawl, their tiny murmurs almost lost to the rush of wind. By the time he reached his cabin in the snow-lined hills, the air smelled of snow. The sky sagged with heavy clouds, the first flakes drifting like pale ash. His cabin crouched beneath a stand of pines, its timbers gray with weather and smoke. Smoke already whispered from its chimney, for he had left a fire banked before his day's ride. The door creaked open, and the smell of resin and old wood greeted him. He carried Clara inside, laying her gently beside the hearth. The fire painted her face in golden shadow, the wounds glistening where her dress clung to them. Ezekiel's hands, more accustomed to reins and rifle, worked clumsily but steadily. He tore strips of linen from an old shirt, binding her shoulder, pressing cloth against her ribs. His movements bore the memory of another life, the soldier's life when he had dressed wounds not his own under the smoke of cannon and the cries of dying men. Clara's eyes fluttered open. Fever clouded them, yet they held a strange clarity. "Thomas," she whispered, though her gaze fixed not on Ezekiel but on some vision only she could see. "He said he'd build a home, with a porch facing east. Said he'd carve a rocking chair. For when our hair turned silver," her words trembled like threads, each sentence a fragment that frayed into silence. Ezekiel said nothing. He fed the stove another log, the iron groaning as heat surged, sparks drifting up the chimney. Shadows of the rocking chair stretched long across the floor, its back curved like a sentinel over them all. The old tools hanging on the wall, axe, spade, hammer, looked solemn, as though they too bore witness. The twins stirred, soft cries breaking the hush. Ezekiel lifted one into the crook of his arm, swaying gently, his scarred face leaning close. The infant smelled of milk and wool, fragile warmth against his chest. He had not held a child since his own boy, years gone. The memory cut deeper than any wound, yet he did not put the child down. Snow began to fall heavy, the sound muffled as it pressed against roof and shutter. The world outside grew silent, buried in white. The nearest town lay half a day's ride away, and in such weather no doctor could be reached. They were alone, 3 souls tied to the fading breath of a mother who hovered between this world and the next. Clara's voice returned in whispers. She spoke of a wedding dress once stitched with her own hands, ivory muslin now folded in a trunk far from here. She spoke of fear, that her children would grow cold in a world too harsh for their softness. Her hand reached blindly, fumbling until Ezekiel's rough palm steadied it. She gripped him as though anchoring herself, her bloodied shawl slipping from her shoulder. That shawl, once warm with the scent of lavender, was now torn and stained. Yet it seemed to Ezekiel a flag of maternal strength, a fabric that had shielded life against death. He laid it gently over the infants, as if the gesture itself carried some promise he did not yet understand. Through long hours he kept vigil. He rocked one child while the other lay curled against Clara's chest, their breath faint puffs against her skin. At times she drifted into sleep so shallow he feared she had crossed over, only to stir again, lips moving in prayer. Ezekiel's heart wrestled with truths he had long buried. He knew the land's cruelty, knew that no man could save all who stumbled on its stones. Yet as he watched the twins' tiny fingers curl around their mother's braid, he felt the weight of her trust pressed down like the snow gathering on his roof. By dawn, Clara's strength faltered further. Her eyes sought Ezekiel, not with words this time, but with pleading silence. He understood. It was more than survival she placed in his hands. It was the shaping of lives, the raising of souls, the carrying of a dream she would not see fulfilled. He stoked the fire higher, though the warmth it cast could not answer the chill inside him. His gaze lingered on the rifle above the hearth, and for the first time in years, it looked less a weapon of his wandering days and more a burden of guardianship. The storm closed them in, a white shroud upon the hills. Within the cabin, under its low rafters, a scarred man bent his life around 2 small children and the fragile flame of a dying woman. He did not yet know what this would make of him, only that his wandering had ended at her bedside. The storm did not pass quickly. It settled upon the snow-lined hills with the patience of eternity, blanketing ridge and hollow until the world beyond the cabin was swallowed in white. Wind pressed hard against the shutters, rattling them like restless spirits. The door creaked in its frame as if testing its own strength against the gale. Inside, the small cabin became a world entire, its boundaries marked by the stove's red glow, the rocking chair's slow rhythm, and the measured sound of Clara's broken breath. Ezekiel Boone moved through those days with the steadiness of a man trapped between memory and duty. He rose each morning, or what passed for morning under a sky smothered by cloud, tended the fire, warmed broth over the stove, and pressed the cup to Clara's lips. Most times she could swallow only a sip, the liquid trembling at her mouth before sliding away down her chin. He wiped her gently with a cloth the way one might tend a child. Other times she turned her face aside, drifting into the shadows where pain dulled thought. When not at her side, he turned to the twins. Goat's milk, warmed in a tin pan, dribbled from a rag he had fashioned into a teat. Their small cries echoed against the cabin walls, high and insistent, pulling him from his weariness. At times he paced with them in his arms, their heads resting beneath his beard, their breath warm against his neck. At other times he rocked them in the chair, the creak of its boards keeping time with the sigh of the storm outside. The vigil gnawed at him, body and spirit alike. His back ached from bending, his hands cracked from cold and work, but worse than weariness was memory. Long years ago he had ridden hard for cattle wages while fever took his wife and boy in a sod house 2 valleys away. He had not returned in time. The guilt had followed him like a shadow, driving him deeper into the frontier until only solitude had been his company. Now tending these children, binding this woman's wounds, he felt the ache of all he had failed before. At night, the cabin filled with smells, wet wool steaming by the stove, boiled coffee simmering long after its strength had gone, the sharp tang of pine sap from burning logs. Firelight flickered across Ezekiel's scarred face, painting the furrows in his skin like canyons carved by regret. The rifle above the hearth glimmered in that light, a silent sentinel. Once it had meant survival. Now it seemed to loom as accusation, a reminder of every life taken, every moment bought with violence. The snow pressed against the cabin walls, piling higher each day. Ezekiel began to think of it not only as weather, but as grief itself, pressing, suffocating, sealing them from the living world. The isolation was complete, yet within that isolation grew something else, faint but stubborn, the bond between himself and the small lives entrusted to him. One night, when the storm howled fiercest, Clara stirred with a clarity that startled him. Her eyes, though sunken, shone with a light that seemed borrowed from some realm beyond pain. She lifted a trembling hand and beckoned him closer. From beneath her pillow she drew a strand of her own hair, long and dark despite the pallor of her skin. With what strength she could muster, she twisted it into a small braid. Ezekiel reached to steady her hands, rough palms guiding her delicate work. When it was done, she pressed the braid into his grasp. "A mother's thread," she whispered. Her voice was thin, but her eyes glistened with a mixture of surrender and hope. "So they will. Remember?" Ezekiel's throat closed. He looked at the tiny ribbon of hair, fragile as gossamer yet strong in meaning. He felt as though she had woven not only her memory into it, but also her plea, her love, her command. The twins stirred in their sleep, as if some instinct drew them nearer to the sound of her voice. He placed the braid carefully on the mantel, beside the fire's glow where it seemed to hold vigil with him. The storm carried on. Days blurred into nights, nights into days. Ezekiel fought to keep Clara alive, though each hour left her weaker. Still, he whispered words he had never thought to speak again. Soft reassurances, fragments of prayer, even lullabies half remembered from his own childhood. He had not sung in years, not since before the fever stole his family, but the sound rose in the cabin nonetheless, low and rough yet steady. Through the long vigil, Ezekiel came to understand something he had not dared to before. Saving these children might not only preserve their lives, but might also salvage his own. Each feeding, each cry answered, each breath of Clara's that still rattled like a loose window pane was proof that his heart had not gone entirely to stone. The rifle above the hearth remained untouched, though more than once he glanced at it when the wind moaned like wolves in the timber. It stood as a relic of the man he had been. The braid upon the mantel, by contrast, stood as a promise of the man he might yet become. Between them he lived his vigil, caught between killing and keeping, between loss and redemption. And so, while the snow deepened and the storm raged, the cabin became less a shelter and more a crucible. In its small, smoke-filled rooms, a scarred wanderer learned again the shape of tenderness, and the first embers of healing glowed faint within the ashes of grief. Dawn crept pale and cold across the snow-lined hills. The storm had broken in the night, leaving the land hushed under its shroud of white. Snow lay deep against the cabin walls, glowing faintly blue through the frost of the window. Inside, the fire had burned low, embers flickering faint like eyes closing in sleep. Ezekiel sat in the rocking chair, one twin drowsing in the crook of his arm, the other wrapped against his chest. He had not slept, though his body begged for it. His eyes lingered on Clara, who lay upon the bed where the firelight touched her face in soft glow. Her breath rattled faintly, shallow as if each moment might be her last. When the first rim of sun gilded the snow outside, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark yet strangely calm. With trembling hands, she beckoned him closer. Ezekiel laid the children gently against her, lifting each twin into her arms. She cradled them with a strength drawn from some hidden well, pressing kisses to their foreheads. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, though her voice when it came was steady. "Do not let them grow cold in this world," she whispered. The words carried no fear, only command, the distillation of a mother's will. Ezekiel nodded, though his throat tightened until no answer could pass. He watched as she wrapped the torn shawl around herself and the babies, her arms forming one last shelter. Her eyes closed, the faintest smile touching her lips, and as the fire guttered low, her breath faltered then ceased, leaving only the quiet suckle of the children against her still breast. She had chosen the rocking chair for her last rest. There she sat, shawl drawn close, twins sleeping unaware in her lap. For a moment she seemed not dead but merely weary, as though she would wake again when the snow melted. Yet Ezekiel knew. He bowed his head, resting his rough hand on the braid she had given him, and let silence fill the room. The hours that followed passed like stone. When the children slept, he lifted them carefully from her arms, laying them in the cradle he had built from pine boards. Then he wrapped Clara in a clean blanket, the shawl folded across her chest like a banner. He took his shovel from its peg, stepped into the biting air. The ground beneath the cedar tree was frozen, hard as iron. Each strike rang out sharp, echoing across the still hills. The work was slow, his breath rising in clouds, sweat freezing on his brow. Yet he did not falter. This too was duty. This too was love. By midday the grave was dug. He laid her gently within, her face peaceful, the shawl enfolding her. Kneeling in the snow, Ezekiel whispered words rough and halting, part prayer, part farewell. "Lord, keep her safe. She gave all she had. May her rest be warmer than this earth." He marked the mound with a rough-hewn board, carving her name with the point of his knife. Clara Hensley. Beneath it he etched a cross, simple, unadorned. The cedar's branches leaned overhead, their needles whispering in the mountain wind. When it was done, he stood long beside the grave, snowflakes drifting across the fresh earth. His breath smoked into the air, mingling with silence. Something within him felt broken clean through, yet at the same time bound by new cord. He was no longer merely a man alone in the hills. He was the keeper of her plea, the bearer of her promise. Back inside, the cabin seemed emptier, the shadows longer. The twins stirred restlessly, their small fists curling and uncurling as though reaching for the warmth that had left them. Ezekiel lifted them, one against each arm. Their bodies were feather-light, yet he felt the weight of the world in holding them. He sat again in the rocking chair, its creak filling the hollow quiet. With each motion, resolve hardened in him, slow as ice but sure as stone. He would not wander again. He would not let the past steal these children as it had stolen his own. His gaze lifted to the mantel. The braid of Clara's hair lay where he had set it, glistening faintly in the firelight. He touched it with reverence, as though it were scripture. It was more than memory. It was tether, vow, covenant. Above, the rifle rested in its place. Once it had been his companion, his survival. Now it seemed to him not a weapon for roaming battlefields, but a sentinel of hearth and home. Should danger come, it would be lifted not for pride nor coin, but for protection. For them, for her memory. The silence pressed deep, yet within it flickered something steady, a flame that grief could not quench. Ezekiel sharpened his resolve with the same care he later sharpened his axe, knowing that each day to come would demand labor, patience, and strength. Clara was gone. But her spirit lived in the fragile breaths of her twins, in the braid that glistened upon the mantel, in the vow carved quietly into Ezekiel Boone's heart. They would not grow cold in this world. The seasons turned slowly in the snow-lined hills, each carrying its own trials, each shaping the cabin and those within it. What began with 2 infants swaddled in sorrow grew into a rhythm of days marked not by wandering miles, but by the steady work of keeping children alive in a land that showed no mercy. At first, the twins lived as shadows of fragility. Ezekiel rose before dawn, feeding them goat's milk warmed over the iron stove, his big hands clumsy as they steadied the rag he had fashioned into a teat. They wailed at night, their cries rising sharp against the timbers until he rocked them one at a time in the creaking chair, his voice low with lullabies dredged from memory. The same chair where Clara had breathed her last became the place where her children found sleep, as though her presence lingered in its worn curve. Months passed. The babies grew from helplessness to motion, crawling across pine plank floors, tugging at the hem of his trousers, scattering the tools he once kept in neat rows. Ezekiel, who had once known only the loading of rifles and the branding of cattle, learned to boil porridge, to stitch cloth into makeshift shoes, to hum while he worked. His rough fingers, more suited to hammer and rain, grew deft at braiding a girl's hair and tying knots small enough to fasten a boy's toy. The cabin transformed with them. Where once the walls had been bare but for the old soldiers' tools, now they bore drawings scratched in charcoal, lopsided horses, crooked trees, stick figures with wild grins. The smell of strong coffee in the mornings mingled with the sweet tang of milk, with wood smoke, with the damp scent of wool drying by the fire. The place no longer echoed with silence. It hummed with life. Yet danger did not vanish with laughter. One winter night, wolves circled the cabin, their howls carrying through the dark like a dirge. Ezekiel stood at the window, rifle in hand, eyes sharp as the beasts prowled in the moonlight. When they drew too near, he fired a shot into the night, the crack splitting the silence, sending yellow eyes scattering back into the pines. His heart slowed only when he turned and saw the children sleeping soundly, untouched by fear. Another time, marauders came riding lean horses, sniffing for easy prey. They saw smoke rising from the chimney and thought to take what they could. Ezekiel met them with the rifle braced in his arms, his voice steady though his body thrummed with old instincts. He told them this land held nothing worth their blood. They sneered, but his stance was firm, his eyes unflinching, and after a long silence they turned their mounts back to the trail. The children never knew of the danger, but Ezekiel did. He understood then. Every threat faced was no longer for coin nor pride, but for family. Through all of it, symbols gathered around them like silent witnesses. The rifle above the hearth, once a weapon of survival, now hung as a sentinel of protection. The braid Clara had given still rested on the mantel, untouched by dust, a promise that shaped every breath Ezekiel took. And in the old chest at the foot of the bed lay the wedding dress Clara had once spoken of, its muslin folded carefully, never worn. He could not bring himself to bury it. Instead, it remained as both ache and beacon, love unfinished yet reborn through the lives of her children. Rain became another symbol. Once its tapping on the roof had been a dirge, a hollow sound that reminded him of all he had lost. But as seasons passed, rain turned into lullaby. The children fell asleep to its rhythm, and Ezekiel found himself listening not with dread but with peace. The years pressed forward. The twins learned to walk, first staggering across the grass in spring, then running fearless into the summer fields. Their laughter carried down the slopes, echoing against the pines. Ezekiel followed behind, slower, older, but with a heart that had grown lighter. He watched them gather wildflowers, chase each other through tall grass, collapse breathless with joy. In their laughter, he felt something unshakable: redemption. Each day demanded labor, chopping wood, hauling water, mending roofs, warding off storms. But the burden no longer felt heavy. The children's presence leavened the work, made the hardships purposeful. They rooted him into life the way cedar roots cling stubbornly to the rocky soil. And within himself he felt change. No longer did he see a scarred relic of the frontier, a man condemned to solitude. Instead he saw a father, unlikely, unwilling at first, yet now bound more surely than blood could bind. He was shepherd not of cattle nor coin, but of a miracle carried from death into life. By the time the twins could run laughing through summer's tall grass, Ezekiel Boone was no longer merely surviving the hills. He was living them, and though sorrow lingered, etched into his face, marked in the cedar grave, joy walked beside it hand in hand. The raising of the twins had not erased his grief, but it had reshaped it, transfigured it into strength, into devotion, into something resembling grace. The years slipped by like water down the mountain streams, carving their mark quietly yet surely into the land, into the cabin, into the lives that had taken root there. The twins, once fragile swaddled bundles pressed against their dying mother's breast, had grown tall and strong in the thin mountain air. Their laughter now carried over the ridges, clear as church bells, chasing one another through the fields of late summer grass. Ezekiel Boone sat in the doorway, the evening light spilling across the slope, his hands folded over the handle of his cane. His beard, once black and fierce, had grown long and streaked with gray, and the lines around his eyes told of winters endured, storms weathered, and long nights by the fire. The rocking chair creaked beneath him, steady and familiar, as he watched the two young souls move about their chores. They gathered firewood without complaint, their arms strong enough now to carry full logs from the stack. They filled pails with water from the stream, boots splashing in its cold current. They laughed and jostled, their movements confident, born of years spent learning resilience in the hills. Around their necks, braided locks of their mother's hair hung like talismans, carried always, never forgotten. A storm brewed in the distance, the clouds swelling dark above the horizon, the air carrying the smell of rain. Once, storms had been omens of dread to Ezekiel, days of fear, of wolves circling the cabin, of marauders in the night, of grief pressing close as the snow. But now, as thunder rumbled faintly across the hills, he felt only calm. Storms no longer promised despair. They promised endurance. His children, Clara's children, would weather them as surely as the cedar tree that stood over her grave. Inside, the cabin bore its history like scripture. The iron stove, polished by years of use, glowed with the memory of countless fires. The rifle above the hearth remained, untouched for many seasons now, no longer a weapon of blood but a relic of protection fulfilled. Charcoal drawings still clung to the walls, though faded with time, marks of small hands once learning to hold. The rocking chair moved slowly beneath Ezekiel, its creak carrying memory, its weight softened by the presence of children who had once been rocked to sleep in its arms. The years had made him slower. His hands, once steady as stone when loading a rifle, trembled when he tied knots or stitched cloth. Yet his eyes had softened. Where bitterness had once hollowed him out, a quiet gratitude had taken root. He had not sought this life, had not asked for this duty, but it had come all the same, and it had remade him. As the storm drew closer, the twins hurried their pace, stacking wood neatly by the door, latching the shutters, preparing as he had taught them. Their voices mingled with the rising wind, a hymn of resilience born not of books or sermons but of survival. Ezekiel leaned back, watching them with a gaze that carried both pride and wonder. He thought then of Bitter Creek, the rifle shot that had shattered the stagecoach, the sight of Clara clutching her twins in bloodied shawl, the rasp of her last words, "Save my twins." He thought of the night spent by the hearth, her breath rattling, his prayers rising like smoke. He thought of the cedar grave where he had bent his head and sworn to keep her children warm in a cold world. And now, here they stood, alive, strong, laughing. The miracle, he realized, was not thunderous nor divine. It was not the hand of heaven striking down enemies, nor some grand salvation at the edge of death. No, the miracle had been quieter, humbler, wrought in small acts repeated day upon day. It was in the feeding of infants by the glow of firelight. It was in the mending of shoes, the braiding of hair, the soothing of fevers, the chasing of wolves, the steady hand that held fast through storms. The miracle was not only that the twins had survived. The miracle was that in saving them they had saved him. They had taught a broken man how to live again, how to sit in peace with the past, how to find in his own scars the shape of something like grace. Night settled gently across the hills. The first drops of rain tapped against the cedar marker where Clara slept, each drop like a soft benediction. The fire within the cabin flickered, shadows playing across the timbers, painting the years into every beam. The twins came inside, cheeks flushed, arms strong, eyes bright. They set down the pails and the last of the logs, shaking rain from their hair, their laughter echoing off the walls that had once held only silence. Ezekiel Boone looked at them, his eyes lingering on the braids they wore around their necks, the threads of a mother's love woven through time. He drew a long breath, his chest heavy yet full, and whispered into the fire, words meant for Clara, words meant for the years that had passed like smoke. I kept them warm. The rocking chair moved beneath him, steady as a heartbeat. The rifle remained untouched above the hearth. The storm washed across the land, rain and thunder mingling with laughter and firelight. And in that quiet, enduring moment, Ezekiel Boone knew the truth. Grief can be remade into hope when one chooses to bear another's burden. Life itself, fragile, stubborn, and fierce, was the miracle.